In this lesson, we start our discussion on the non-aligned movement, a multilateral alliance with a difference, which came up after the Second World War. Let us start our discussion with the origins and an overall overview of the non-aligned movement. Winston Churchill, the wartime Prime Minister of Britain, said in his historic speech that we shall fight on the beaches, in the hills, in the trenches, and on the streets. We will fight everywhere, but we will not surrender. And that is what they did. The Allies kept on fighting till they were able to defeat the Axis powers and bring the Second World War to an end. Now over here we see joyous crowds celebrating the 8th of March 1945 as the Victory Day, and also as the day when the Second World War officially ended in Europe. Everyone looks so happy, don't they? But if we get out of Europe, things were a bit different. There was no cause for victory. If you see this map carefully, you will be able to understand the majority of the world at the time of the Second World War were colonies of the major powers. Now, in that case, if any of these major powers start fighting against each other, what do you think the people of their colonies do? Do they wait while the fighting continues? No, they are supposed to fight for their colonial masters, and that is exactly what they did in the First World War, in the Second World War, and countless other regional wars. But a question might come in your mind that why were these people of the colonies fighting in someone else's war, in a war which does not even involve them directly? This is because they were promised something. They were promised something which you and I would not be able to appreciate because we already enjoy it. But it is something which the people of the colonies desperately wanted to achieve. The thing I'm talking about is freedom. The people of the colonies desperately wanted to achieve their freedom and to also win their country their independence. These colonial powers therefore realized that this could be a good leverage mechanism. Therefore, the colonial powers promised the people of the colonies independence and more control over their countries if they support the war effort. And that is how the major powers were able to get the bulk of their army from the colonies. Now, the end of the Second World War marked happiness all around the world. This is because they achieved something they wanted, which is victory. But what about the people in the colonies? They were promised of independence. Did they achieve it? They did not, because they were given empty and hollow promises. That is when the people of the colonies realized that they can only achieve their independence if they fight against their colonial masters, not for them, and thus started their independence struggles. Now we clearly remember about the independence struggle of India. We also know how our brave freedom fighters were dedicated to win for us our independence. Now to know more about India's struggle for independence, you can click on the link below to access the iDictionary feature. Now, India was not the only country that was fighting for its independence. Other colonies and dependencies of the major powers such as Yugoslavia, Indonesia, and countless other such territories were also fighting for their independence. Now the independence struggle of India, Yugoslavia, and Indonesia are particularly important because they are relevant for our discussion of the non-aligned movement. Can you answer a question? What do you think happens to a bird which has managed to get itself free from a cage and escape? Do you think that bird ever wants to return to its cage? The answer is no, right? That is what happened to these newly independent countries. Now, these countries had been under colonial subjugation for centuries. In fact, they had been fighting someone else's wars for centuries. Now that they were independent, they wanted to focus on their own national development and did not want to get engaged or involved in someone else's wars. But the end of the Second World War managed to bring about a scenario where these nations were not able to enjoy their independence for long. And that is because another war was looming. Now, this is not the kind of war we are usually familiar with because this is the Cold War. Cold War was an ideological conflict primarily. It was an ideological conflict between USA and USSR. This is because USA was a liberal democratic country based around the ideology of capitalism, and USSR was a communist country. And both of these nations emerged as the superpowers at the end of the Second World War. And they shared a lot of animosity against each other. And this caused a conflict between the two of them, where they were constantly expanding their spheres of influence to showcase who is stronger. Now, all these things led to a situation where people started to feel that another world war was looming. To know more about the Cold War in detail, you can click on the link below to access the iDictionary feature. Now, how can a war of ideology such as the Cold War lead to a condition where people felt that another world war was looming? This is because even though the Cold War was an ideological conflict, it did not mean that the countries or the two sides were simply throwing away their weapons. Quite on the contrary, the Cold War period holds a record for the maximum amount of weapon stockpiling of human history. And these weapons were not only restricted to conventional forms, but also included nuclear weapons. In fact, the nuclear weapons that were developed around this time were about 80 times deadlier than the ones used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, the entire Cold War was about building tension. Nuclear weapons itself was a very important aspect of creating tension. You can see in this newspaper article over here where it says Russia has atomic bomb and US learns of recent explosion. You can understand how the two sides are creating tension, where Russia has tested its atomic bomb, which is giving a statement to USA that they are the only ones which has nuclear weapons. Therefore, tension creation was a very important aspect of the Cold War. Thus, we understand that the Cold War was all about building tension, and this was primarily done through military intimidation and espionage. Now, there were some instances where the Cold War period did heat up at times. In fact, there were instances of military action. However, it did not involve direct military confrontation of the two superpowers, and instead led to a situation where each superpower took a side in an ongoing conflict. These were known as proxy wars. Now, we can see some of those proxy wars in these newspaper articles, where we can see the Korean conflict as well as the Vietnam War in display. So these were the various ways how the Cold War was able to convince people that another world war was looming. The Cold War also managed to divide the world into three parts. And the first division was USA and its allies. And we can see that in the color green, and this formed the capitalist world. The second grouping was USSR and its allies. We can see that in red, and this formed the communist world. The third division included the countries that did not join either of the blocs and were mostly underdeveloped nations of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. This made up the Third World, and these Third World countries were mostly former colonial possessions of the European nations, as we have seen the map of the Third World previously as well as the map of various colonies. What was the position of these Third World countries in the Cold War? Both USA and USSR were aggressively expanding their spheres of influence. However, these nations of the Third World were mostly newly independent, and they did not want to join either of the blocs. But what were they to do in this particular situation? They knew that in this bipolar world created by USA and USSR, they could not stay silent, as inaction often is perceived as action. At the same time, they could not afford to make both the superpowers their own enemies, as that would be downright foolish. They wanted to have a collective of their own where they can come together and they can state their neutrality to this bipolar conflict and still not be perceived as a threat. Because the first world already had its own alliance, NATO, and the second world already had its own, which was the Warsaw Pact. What was the alliance for the Third World? This was a question looming in every Third World country. And out of that question came up the non-aligned movement, a movement for nations which wished to not join either sides of the ongoing Cold War. And now we will see what exactly was the non-aligned movement. The non-aligned movement was founded and held its first conference at Belgrade, which is in Yugoslavia, in the year 1961. Over here we can see a glimpse of the first conference in progress. Now, can you answer this question? Where was the first conference of the non-aligned movement held in the year 1961? Was it in Hong Kong, in Delhi, in Belgrade, or in Lahore? The correct answer is Belgrade. What was the purpose of the non-alignment movement at the time of its inception? Now, the purpose of this movement was to ensure the national independence, the sovereignty, the territorial integrity, as well as the security of the non-aligned countries in their struggle against imperialism, colonialism, neocolonialism, racism, and all forms of foreign subjugation. We will be seeing how important the struggle against these social evils were at this time as we discuss the various factors behind the rise of the non-alignment movement. This movement was formed during the Cold War period as a collective of states not willing to formally align themselves with either of the blocs, which is the bloc of United States or the bloc of the Soviet Union. But instead, they sought to remain neutral as long as their national interest was not threatened. So the non-alignment movement emerged as a way to prevent the creation of a bipolar world order by USA and USSR in this Cold War period. Non-alignment movement is not just about neutrality in the Cold War period, but it was also about making sure the Cold War does not turn into a Third World War situation. That is why the non-aligned movement tried to act as a stabilizing force between the two superpower blocs and even helped in the de-escalation of tension by acting as mediators. So the neutrality which it took up was not only for their own national interests, it was also for the interests of the greater good of the world itself. Now, the non-aligned movement emerged under the leadership of Jawaharlal Nehru, Gamal Abdel Nasser, Kwame Nkrumah, Joseph Broz Tito, and Ahmed Sukarno. Jawaharlal Nehru was a noted statesman and was a very important figure in the Indian independence struggle and served as the first Prime Minister of independent India. Gamal Abdel Nasser was an Egyptian politician who managed to overthrow a monarchy in Egypt and then went on to serve as the president of Egypt. Kwame Nkrumah was also a very important politician and he managed to free the west coast of Africa from British subjugation and then went on to serve as the first president of Ghana. Joseph Broz Tito was a socialist revolutionary of Yugoslavia and he went on to create the Socialist Federation of Yugoslavia and served as the lifetime president of Yugoslavia. And finally, Ahmed Sukarno was the face of the Indonesian independence struggle, and after Indonesia managed to win independence, he served as the first president of Indonesia. So these stalwarts not only acted as the leaders of the non-alignment movement, but they were also the faces of it. However, the non-aligned movement is not an organization and therefore has no permanent secretariat and also no constitution of its own. In this particular movement, every member has an equal weightage when it comes to making decisions. Over here we see a conference of the non-aligned movement in process. Non-aligned movement, however, was not just created for the Cold War period. The movement still exists, and in the current date, the non-aligned movement has 120 members from the regions of Africa, Asia, Latin America, as well as the Middle East, alongside having 17 observer nations and various other international organizations also act as observers of the NAM. Now, over here we see a map where we can see the countries which are marked in dark blue are the member countries of NAM, and the countries marked in light blue are the observer countries, and the rest of the world are non-members. So we can understand clearly that the NAM, which was created in the Cold War period to deal with the bipolar division of the world, still exists while the Cold War no longer does, and this speaks a lot about its significance. Now that we are able to understand that, we also should be able to understand what does non-alignment truly mean, and that is something we will be looking at in the subsequent lecture. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon. You can also register for free at DeltaStep.com or download the DeltaStep app to learn one-to-one with our amazing teachers or to get access to all our 5,000 plus amazing videos as per your school syllabus. Master each topic with our adaptive practice technology. Get million plus questions with step-by-step solutions and unlimited mock tests. Get all your doubts resolved instantly. learn via games, and win amazing prizes like PlayStations and iPads. So at DeltaStep, learning is not just fun and easy, it is rewarding too. So register for free now.